Well, here we are at Yellowstone National Park, talk a little bit about environmental ethics and specifically about intrinsic and instrumental value. So the question comes up when we talk about the environment, what kind of value does it have? So when we look at a place like Yellowstone, this is a place we value quite a bit, but we all value it a bit differently. So two kinds of value. One is instrumental value and the other is intrinsic value. So if we say that something has intrinsic value, we say that it has value in its own right. If we say that something has instrumental value, we say that it's useful but doesn't have value in its own right. So an example of instrumental value is, for instance, a hammer that we use as a tool, and it's valuable as long as we can use it as a tool, but if it's no longer useful as a tool, we can use it in another way. So let's talk about some forms of instrumental value. So one way that we think of nature as having instrumental value is just in terms of raw materials. This is a very old-fashioned, traditional way of thinking about it. So if you look at woods here, we can use wood for lumber, and that's kind of value, but it's also a value that depletes the natural resource. Second kind of value is ecosystem services. So one of the things that ecosystems do is provide certain kinds of services to human communities, such as preventing erosion and also helping against flooding in cases of marshes or swamplands. So we look at some of the flooding that has occurred this year, and one thing that scientists notice, is that flooding could be reduced if some of the marshland along those river areas had not been filled in. So that would be a case of ecosystem service. So this ecosystem provides some service to the human community that prevents bad things from happening. We might note that that ecosystem service can have a dollar value attached to it, because if there's property destroyed because of flooding, then that's a dollar value attached to that property. So ecosystem services is a second kind of value. A third kind of value is medical or commercial kinds of value from organisms and plants and animals and so on. So an obvious example here are medicines. A lot of medicines come from organisms. So if you just take something like aspirin, aspirin comes from tree bark. Some of our most effective cancer medicines come from plant materials, and so on. So particularly when we look at places that are very rich in biodiversity, tropical rainforests, coral reef systems, we look at all the kinds of organisms there that have not been studied yet. We can say, well, one reason to preserve those areas is because they have commercial value or medical value that's for human good. Right, so that's another kind, medical commercial value. Another form of value, simply recreational value. So here at Yellowstone, lots of people come around, and they're here because they like the outdoors, they like to travel in it, they like to hike and so forth. Sometimes those forms of recreational values compete with one another. In the case of Yellowstone, there's been an ongoing debate about whether snowmobiles should be allowed during the winter. Folks like to snowmobile in Yellowstone, but there's some issues about whether that affects the wildlife or not. Another problem with recreational value is sometimes we can love nature to death, as can happen with national parks. Yosemite National Park in particular is a potential example of that sort of loving a wilderness area to death. And then in addition to recreational value, we might just say, as a distinct category, aesthetic value. So aesthetic value is about beauty. And so one way to think of the value of wilderness and environment is simply that it's beautiful. And it's beautiful whether we visit it or not. So many of us like the wilderness of Alaska, and we like to preserve it even though we may never actually visit there, although we might get to see it via nature documentaries and so on. So those are several types of instrumental value. That has some strengths, right? Those are very practical reasons to preserve wild areas, ecosystems, so on. But there's also some important weaknesses, particularly when we talk about kinds of instrumental values that have dollar values attached to them. So if you talk about ecosystem services, what that says an ecosystem is valuable as long as it provides some sort of service. If it no longer provides that service, or if it can be provided in a different way, say by building a dam, then that wilderness area is no longer valuable. If a particular species of animal does not have a use for medicine, is not very aesthetically pleasing, that might not be a species worth protecting on instrumental value criteria. If a wilderness area does not have much in the way of recreational value, say Antarctica areas, think of the continent of Antarctica and all the regions, systems that are there, that has limited value in terms of instrumental value. So one of the concerns that comes up is, while instrumental value provides some reasons to preserve the environment, it's very limited. And so that moves some folks to think not in terms of instrumental value, but intrinsic value.